I actually loved this movie because I took notes last night when I was watching it because it was like taking a class.
Yeah, in a little bit,
I
but
loved
not
it.
a boring class.
No, I
that's
mean
the
that in a
important
good way.
thing. Yeah.
This is the Majority Report. I'm Janeane Garofalo here with Sam Seder. And in studio, we are talking to Joel Bakan, author of The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, which has spawned the award-winning documentary of the same name. You can learn more about the dates that you can see the documentary at thecorporation.com. And Joel, this is I have to say, and I mean this as a compliment, I saw the movie last night. It is like taking a class. You learn more in this movie about corporations, the beginnings of them, the nature of them, in such an easily absorbed way. And it really does affect every aspect of your life. And a very interesting thing that you do is you compare the corporation's personality to that of the personality of a psychopath. So can you sort of explain how you came up with the idea to do that?
Yeah, well, a lot of people find the comparison of corporations to psychopaths inflammatory and controversial, but I actually see it as just a kind of accurate analytical metaphor. And when I was sitting in Psych 101 as an undergrad student at college, I learned that a psychopath is a person who is incapable of feeling concern for other people. And when I was sitting in law school in Corporations 101, I learned that a corporation is a person, that the law actually deems a corporation to be a person, and that the law then imbues it with a personality where it says that the corporation always has to act in its own self-interest, that that's a legal imperative of the corporation. So it seemed like a kind of obvious connection that here we have a person who we require to only serve its own self-interest, who's incapable of being concerned about others or about the environment or about the public interest. It seemed like an obvious connection to say, well, if that person were human, we'd probably diagnose it as a psychopath.
So give some examples of the psychopathic personality.
Well, various, the inability to feel empathy, the inability to feel sympathy, the inability to feel guilt, the inability to feel remorse, the lack of any sense of moral obligation to obey the law or to obey social conventions. I mean, those are the kinds of specific characteristics that are usually associated with psychopaths. And when you look at, and this is what we do in both the film and the book, when you look at the corporation, it matches up relatively directly and quite literally with these various characteristics.
All right, so Joe, the first part I want to go back to is this notion that a corporation is an individual, that the state, the government, the society imbues in a corporation the same rights that it would an individual. Now, and everything else seems to be an implication of that. But let's talk about the genesis of how that happened.
I mean, the idea that the corporation is a separate individual from the actual individuals who are part of it can be traced back to Roman law. Where you actually create an artificial entity and you give it the rights of people. But it's probably 17th century England is where you really start to see it develop. And then if you jump ahead to mid-19th century in the United States and England, it's when it really gets entrenched. And the reason for it is quite simple. One of the points of the corporation as a device was to relieve the owners of a particular business of responsibility if things went wrong. In other words, if somebody said, I'm going to invest some money in that firm, they don't want to, because they're investing money in that firm, they don't want to be legally liable if the firm goes bankrupt. They don't want to have their house taken away or their assets seized. So you create this thing called limited liability, where you say that the shareholders are only liable for as much as they put into the thing. Well, if the shareholders are no longer legally liable for what the corporation gets up to, who is? And so the law pulls a rabbit out of the hat. They say, well, let's just create an artificial person who can take the rap for when things go wrong. And that's the corporate person.
I have to say, this reminds me of when my father went away on vacation when I was in high school. And he came back and found some contraband, which I went on to blame on a fake kid, an amalgamation of a kid who supposedly came over and was friends of my friends. I said, if I find out that kid brought that in this house, I will kill that guy. Now, of course, to stretch the metaphor, essentially, this kid now exists and can still do things, even though there's no responsibility that ever come back to him. Now, what would have been, or what could be, an alternate version of a corporation where they don't have all the rights that an individual has?
Well, the alternate version would be simply, and it existed prior to the corporation's rise, it was called a partnership, where a bunch of people are in a business, and if things go wrong, those people are legally liable. The business doesn't have an existence that's separate from the people who own and run it. But that really is the distinguishing characteristic of the corporation, is that you split the ownership of the thing from the actual thing. And so all the owners are kind of invisible. And the real difficulty is that when you've got this artificial person, you can't put an artificial person in jail. So it's very hard to actually control this artificial person, because all you can do is maybe slap its wrist with a fine. And when you look at the laws that apply to corporations and try to protect the environment, try to protect workers' rights, try to protect human rights, the fines usually aren't that substantial. So what this artificial person usually does is says, it's probably cheaper to break the law and to, take the risk of maybe getting a $25,000 fine than to install those filters so that the effluent going out into the stream isn't full of all kinds of toxins. Because if I install, the managers of a corporation say, well, if we install the filters, that's going to cost like 50 grand. If we get caught for not having the filters, that's going to cost 25 grand. So chink, 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 cost benefit analysis, cheaper to break the law, we'll break the law. And you can't put the corporation in jail, and you can't put the people in jail because they're protected by this kid, this artificial person.
I think his name was like Mike Sullivan.
All right, we'll call him Mike Sullivan then.
And another example of what you're talking about, this sort of cost benefit analysis, was like when Ford made the Pinto or something. They know there's a flaw here. They work out for every 100 Pintos we make, half of one will blow up. We'll have to pay for that, but it's still cheaper than fixing it.
There's a very moving story I tell in the book of a woman named Patricia Anderson who was driving, it was actually a Chevy Malibu. It's the same story as the Pinto, but it's GM. I mean, Ford isn't unique. She was rear-ended and her car blew up and her kids were all severely injured. And basically during the trial, they uncovered a memo that had been written by an engineer at GM, which did the actual cost-benefit analysis, assessed the cost of a human life, of losing a person as a result of a fuel-fed fire, at $200,000. So that General Motors would have to pay $200,000 for every person that was killed as a result of this design flaw. And they did the calculation and realized it would be cheaper to just leave the design flaw, not put a metal bracket between the fuel tank and the rear bumper, not have a wider space between the fuel tank and the rear, just leave the design flaw. It'd be, I think it ended up being about $6 cheaper per vehicle on the road to leave the design flaw than to fix it and save potentially many lives.
So Robert McNamara is the personification of the corporate psychopath personality. As you know, if you watch The Fog of War, he talks about the cost of human life and what is acceptable, and he speaks about it in a very clinical way. When we come back from the break, I'd like to talk about the 14th Amendment and how the corporation has availed itself of that for its benefit. This is the Majority Report. I'm Janeane Garofalo here with Sam Seder. We're talking to Joel Bakan, author of The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, which spawned the award-winning documentary of the same name. You can go to thecorporation.com to learn more about that. We'll be right back. Let's talk about the 14th Amendment, which was originally put in place to, I believe, help emancipated African Americans to achieve full personhood in the eyes of the law in the rest of the country. And then, of course, corporate lawyers availed themselves of this amendment. How did they utilize it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the stories in the film that the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause were put in place to protect freed slaves. But corporations saw in it an opportunity, and corporate lawyers in particular saw in it an opportunity. The logic was they said, well, we're considered to be persons at law. And if we're persons at law, the 14th Amendment talks about the rights of persons, then why don't we go to court and say that we have constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment, primarily to try to beat back attempts by governments to regulate and tax the railroads. I mean, that's primarily what was going on at the time. And the court said yes. The court went along with it in a case in the 1880s. And the ensuing roughly 40, 50 years, the U.S. Supreme Court fashioned a set of precedents that gave corporations and businesses immense powers under the Constitution to thwart the attempts of state governments and the federal government to bring in regulations to protect workers, like maximum hour legislation and minimum wages and those sorts of things. It came to a head in the 1930s because Franklin Roosevelt wanted to bring in his New Deal and was concerned that this jurisprudence, the set of laws that the court had crafted, would ultimately lead to his New Deal being struck down as unconstitutional because of all these constitutional rights that the corporations had. So what he did, which was quite clever, is he said, I'm going to change the number of judges on the Supreme Court. I'm going to change it to 14 from 9. And I'm going to put 5 of my pals who see things my way on the court. It was called the court packing plan. And the most amazing thing happened after he threatened to do that. All of a sudden, the court backed off of this approach and started to be very deferential to government's attempts to regulate corporations. And he brought in his New Deal, and there was no constitutional problem. And the rest is history.
Can we talk about the 1934 attempted coup over President Roosevelt from Wall Street?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's not generally found in history textbooks in college or in schools. It was a retired Marine general named Smedley Darlington Butler who...
That's Janeane's favorite
I love Smedley.
Marine.
War is a Racket.
War is a Racket.
Yeah, I love,
exactly. Yeah. He wrote a pamphlet called War is a Racket, and his basic view on the basis of experience. I mean, he was the guy who led the Marines in Central America, in Haiti, and in China, on behalf, by his own confession, of major corporations in Wall Street at the time. And it was actually a personal thing that happened to him that led to this shift from being a sort of, a military tool of Wall Street to being a pacifist, an anti-corporate pacifist. His son signed up for the Marines, and all of a sudden he was faced with the prospect of losing his son, and it caused him to think about what war was really about. And he realized, on the basis of his experience, and I should say he's one of the most highly decorated generals in U.S. military history. I mean, this guy, he rocked as a Marine general. And but he completely shifted gears, and he went on the lecture circuit and was propagating these views that he was just, he said at one point, he said Al Capone thought he was a big deal. He ran 3 cities. I ran 3 continents. So he seemed like exactly the kind of guy that would be useful for leading a coup, overthrowing the U.S. government of Franklin Roosevelt at the time, and people were upset with Roosevelt because of his New Deal and because he'd abandoned the gold standard and other things. Let's get Smedley Butler to raise an army of veterans, and this was the approach that Mussolini had used, and it was to some extent the approach that Hitler had used. It was an approach that was fashionable in France at the time. You get retired, basically veterans, and you put an army together, and he can lead that army on a march on Washington and overthrow Roosevelt, if Roosevelt is unwilling to sort of take himself out of the picture. And then Smedley Darlington Butler would be installed effectively as what was called an assistant president, but really the idea was that Roosevelt would plead ill health and become a figurehead, and Smedley Butler would run the country as a fascist dictator. Now, it seems all too bizarre to be true, but, the documentation is there, and the documentation, in fact, is there in the records of the House Un-Americans Activities Committee, which was a congressional committee which Joe McCarthy later took over to rout out the communist threat. It actually began as a committee that was concerned about the fascist threat in the United States. And so they called Smedley Darlington Butler before them. He told his story. They vindicated his story right down the line, and concluded that, were it not for the general's patriotic actions, there may have actually been a shift to a fascist United States.
Who were the people who approached Smedley?
There were a group of business people led by the DuPont organization, the DuPont family, Remington Steele, director of a number of different corporations, Bethlehem Steel and Goodyear Tire, and J.P. Morgan primarily.
Where is there legal codification of a corporation's personhood? Is that just in the sort of years of judicial rulings, or?
It depends on which state you're in. I mean, in some jurisdictions, it's actually codified in legislation. In other jurisdictions, it's a result of what's called the common law, which is the precedential value of decisions that courts have made that are binding on future courts.
Now, isn't it? I mean, since we know in rational, non-legal terms, we know that corporations are not people, and they were not born with inalienable rights. So isn't it really the question of that government really, in truth, can't constrain corporations, because corporations would not exist were it not for the government giving them a charter to exist?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is one of the key messages of the book and the film, is that the corporation is our construction. We made it. I mean, we the people in a democracy have put governments in place that made corporations, that continue to empower corporations, and that have the authority to do what they want with corporations. I mean, the point is that governments have absolutely no authority to do anything except serve the public interest. That's their institutional mandate. Corporations' institutional mandates serve its self-interest. Government's institutional mandates serve the public interest. So if you play out that logic, the only justification for the existence of the corporation made by government is that it served the public interest. And arguably it's not doing that. It does it in some ways, no question, but arguably the balance between the harms that it's causing in the world and the good that it's causing is currently skewed. And so what really needs to happen is governments, and in a way us as citizens, have to take control back of this institution. It does some things rather well. I mean, it does, produce products and it creates wealth. But we're now living in a time when the ideology is that we should just let it run free. We should let it get as big as it can get. We should give it all our public services through privatization. There's nothing that a corporation can't do, and there's no freedom that it shouldn't have. And that, I think, is very, very dangerous.
Let's talk about externalities, which is a euphemism that economists use for the public cleaning up the mess, literally and monetarily, that is made by the corporations.
Yeah, I mean, an externality is just it's an economic term that I think masks the true horrors that it describes. An externality is any cost that the corporation can unload onto somebody else. And of course, when you're dealing with a cost-benefit calculation, the more that a company can reduce its costs, the more money it can make, the more profit it can make. So when it reduces its costs by imposing them on others, then that's called an externality. So an externality would be all the people in a town who've lost their job because the company decided that it could produce at a lower cost in Honduras. Now, it's not that there are no costs to the corporation moving. It's just that the corporation isn't suffering them. It's the people in the town. So the corporation has effectively taken the extra costs of labor, the difference between the Honduras workers and the workers in the town in, say, the United States, and it saved that money. And it's the workers who have paid the cost for it saving that money. And then the workers in Honduras are paying the cost because they're getting paid 3 cents an hour. And so they're paying the cost. That's the difference between what they're getting paid and what they should be getting paid if they weren't being horribly exploited. So their externalities is their suffering, their poverty, all of that. So all over the place, there are these externalities being created, and the corporation is actually making more money as a consequence.
Now, there's a movement afoot to change the way that we calculate the GDP, which would include those externalities in a broader sense, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Alternative economics and people within the field of economics who are sort of critical. I mean, right now, the way that GDP and GNP are calculated, basically everything is a benefit. I mean, if you destroy a river and create profit as a result through that pollution, then that's only a good thing. And there's no way to take account of the pollution when you're calculating GDP. So what a lot of progressive and alternative economists are saying is we have to have a fuller picture of what's going on. Wealth isn't just the amount of money that's created through extracting and exploiting the earth or labor from people. Wealth includes the health of the people, the welfare of the people. It includes the integrity of the environment. So if we redefine wealth in that way, then we're actually engaged in a much more complicated calculation when it comes to the kind of wealth that we're destroying in order to create other kinds of wealth.
I'd like to talk about the year 1940 with the synthesis of chemicals, which produced a whole new other era in shame for the corporation. And there was one scene in your film that I found devastating where they have a breakdown of some of the problems that are incurred on families, children, from being exposed to these chemicals. And it said, child born without eyes. And that's just another thing in the rundown of things the corporation is not particularly concerned with and that they will continue to lie about. And then you show a picture of the little boy who's born without eyes. And I want to talk about that when we come back from the break. We're talking to Joel Bakan, author of The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, which has spawned the award-winning documentary of the same name. Please go to thecorporation.com to find out where it's playing near you. This is The Majority Report. We'll be right back. Fake commercial.
We're supposed to do a B, C only.
Starbucks.
Expand the C.
Evil corporation. Pus-filled milk.
Going to D.
I might get a staph infection that won't heal, but it's delicious. Before the break, we talked about the new era, 1940, ushering in the new era of synthesizing chemicals, which produced a whole host of deformities and now the cancer epidemic. I believe it's 1 in every 2 men will be stricken with cancer and 1 in every 3 women. Now, can you explain the links between the corporation and the cancer epidemic?
Yeah, I mean, again, the corporation is driven to do whatever it can do in order to create wealth for its shareholders, and when that's combined with certain technological developments, problems can result. And back in the 1940s, it became science revealed various uses for petroleum products, creating all kinds of different chemicals that served various kinds of purposes. I mean, whether it's DDT or whether it's cellophane, to wrap your sandwich in. But basically, the carbon molecule became a source for all kinds of things, plastics, that actually are very toxic. I mean, they're very toxic in terms of people's health. They're very toxic in terms of the environment. And once you create them, it's very difficult to get them out of the system, out of the ecosystem. And there's the difficulty, I mean, in terms of linking that to the corporation, is that with this very sort of potent and dangerous technology, there's no internal kind of constraint in the corporation that would say, hey, maybe we should be careful about how we use this. Corporations can't do that. They're not programmed to do that. So instead, it's just let's produce more of them. Let's get them out as much as we can. And we're not really concerned, and we can't be concerned about what that effect will have on other people. Now, the idea is that government is supposed to be concerned, and government is supposed to pass regulations that appropriately stop the influx of these chemicals into the environment, and that deals with disposal and all of these other sorts of, whether it's PCBs or plastics or whatever. The problem is that for the last 30 years, we have been in a political context that has said deregulation is good. Now, what we should do is we shouldn't be regulating corporations. So here we have an institution that's incapable of regulating itself, that is producing and disseminating very toxic things into the environment. And we have governments under the, severe lobbying and campaign financing of corporations rolling back the already relatively weak constraints that exist designed to protect public health and the environment. And that's really the equation that we're dealing with today. And, what I say in my book is this is insanity. I mean, if we really understand the nature of the corporation, then we should also understand that this is a bit of a monster that has to be put on a leash.
I mean, that's really the issue. I mean, the point is that if you're going to say this entity is legally a person, you should hold that legal person to the same standards you would hold a flesh and blood person. And instead, we now have this contextual framework where we talk about letting restraints off of corporations or constraining them, when in fact, it's the government that gives them permissions and privileges for everything they do, including their very existence.
Yeah.
Now, just to wrap it up, you say that their only self-interest, they're legally responsible for their own self-interest. Is there the only individual liability is, in fact, if you do not maximize profits for the corporation?
That's correct. I mean, it's illegal for a director or a manager of a corporation to be genuinely socially responsible. We hear a lot of PR about social responsibility, but it's really just PR.
So when people call corporations evil, what they're really saying is that they're simply completely amoral. I think you compared it to a shark.
Amoral and dangerous are terms I prefer to use to evil. I mean, in the institution, we've created an amoral entity. The problem is that we're giving it more and more power and more license, and that, for us as a society, I think is a self-destructive route.
And in summation, I'd say another interesting point you make in the film is that the corporation is guilty of intergenerational tyranny, meaning that this is taxation without representation, since your grandchildren's grandchildren will be paying the price physically and literally for all the externalities, if you will, of what the corporation has wrought.
Those chemicals probably have half-lives of 500,000, a million years. I mean, they don't just sort of dissolve, and that's that, and we're through with it. Absolutely, yeah.
So what it is, this is an uplifting film.
It is.
Bring the family. No, actually,
this
is
happy ending.
Yeah. Actually, this should be mandatory viewing. This is one of the most jam-packed with easily absorbed facts,
but funny and entertaining.
And the narratress, sounds just like every voice from a science fiction film that will tell you that you need to evacuate the ship. Kind of sexy female voice that tells you must get off in T-minus 10 seconds or you'll explode.
Have now boarded.
Thank you.
The Klingons have now boarded.
You have T-minus 7 seconds to exit the ship. Now let's go to animal experimentation and Monsanto. And the pus and the milk that we enjoy.
Yeah, it's a quite disturbing and difficult to watch part of the film. What it's about is the hormone RGBH, which is produced by Monsanto, and it's injected into cows to have cows produce more milk. And as Jeremy Rifkin points out in the film, I mean, this is a ridiculous notion because the world, as he points out, is awash in milk. I mean, there's no shortage.
And the government pays people not
the government actually pays
milk.
farmers not to produce milk. So here we have a product that's designed to get cows to produce more milk. Now the problem is that when you inject it in the cows, they get sick. And their bodies are not meant to produce that much milk, so they get, in particular, mastitis. And in order to treat the mastitis, which is very painful for the animals, they have to take antibiotics. And so what you end up with is a milk supply that has these hormones, these artificial hormones within it, and a pretty high bacterial count as a result of the sickness of the cows, and also antibiotics in the milk. So you end up with quite a stew in the milk of some things that are quite dangerous. Now,
and what would Thomas Friedman say if the Europeans didn't want to drink this pus-filled milk, Sam?
That's so quaint.
Thomas Friedman, our nemesis.
Well, the Europeans don't, and they've actually passed laws that say you can't use this hormone, as we have in Canada.
There was an article, I don't want to spend too much time on it. There was an article that Friedman wrote about how he was having lunch in Davos, and he noticed there was an asterisk next to the U.S. beef that they were serving, and it said, "We want to inform you that it's actually got genetically modified organic materials in it, or could, because the cow may have eaten, some type of hybrid Franken lettuce or something like that."
Or
and
its
he
friend.
He thought it was very quaint and typical of what was wrong with Europe, and then somehow tied that into why he would not take Europeans' problems with going into Iraq seriously.
It's true.
I mean, it's fascinating. But I just ask you, now when a company comes up with a product like this, which makes cows, create more milk, do they stumble upon this and say, hey, this will create more milk? Now, there's no demand for it, but if we put out some nice looking videos, we can convince people that they are a demand, or they can maximize their profits? Or is this something that they actually said, this will be really easy to develop, and then we can just worry about marketing it later?
I mean, I don't know, but clearly from the perspective of an individual farmer who has, say, 40 milk cows, as Monsanto points out to them, and I think this is probably received by them, if each of those milk cows is producing 30% more milk, then each of those units, as they're pointed out, as they're called, each of those units is more profitable.
So it's basically
because you're feeding them the same amount of feed, and all of your costs are roughly the same. You inject them with this thing, they're producing more milk. You take it to market and you sell it.
And how it affects us is with the antibiotics that are in the pus milk, and it's called Posilac.
Yeah, Posilac.
Posilac. That means that perhaps you get a staph infection, and because of the antibiotics in the milk, you can't be cured. Your staph infection could kill you.
Yeah, and I mean that's pointed out, but there isn't sort of hard science on exactly what the links are, but there's good reason to believe that that not only antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria, but also cancer and other sorts of things may be linked to these kinds of bacteria and hormones and whatnot that are in the milk.
This is a perfect example of what we had talked about in part one of this interview, which is an externality.
It's an externality.
We know there's no benefit to it because we don't need the milk as a society.
But there is profit made by it. That's the benefit.
Profit made by certain individuals. Right. And by Monsanto in this situation, but there's no benefit. And to the extent that there is any cost to society, be it cancer, be it other diseases, be it staph infections, is absorbed by the consumer.
That's right. And you raise an interesting point in terms of mentioning Europe, because in Europe, they have adopted what's called the precautionary principle in terms of a lot of their regulatory legislation. What the precautionary principle says, and I advocate it in my book, is that even if you can't prove scientifically, absolute, lockdown case that X causes Y, that putting this stuff in the milk supply causes human health problems. Even if you can't prove it, if the evidence is highly suggestive, that's enough to justify regulating it.
When on doubt, err on the side of caution,
of
which
safety
seems reasonable.
and caution, and that's something that I think a lesson can be learned from Europe in this country and in Canada for that matter. When dealing with dangerous types of things, it's very hard to make an absolute scientific case that if that the ozone is being destroyed by greenhouse gases. That's a controversial point. There are scientists arguing both sides of that case. But, the implications are pretty serious. So maybe we should just, be cautious about it. And that's a principle underlying European legislation. That's why they deal with this issue differently than they do in this country.
Well, speaking of what things people can do and what things people are doing, because the movie ends on sort of an up note, despite the, amount of evil that has been presented prior to that point. Yeah. But so talk about what people are doing.
Well, I mean, I think it's an up note because I think when you look at history is really nothing other than a story of one apparently omnipotent, dominant system crumbling, being humbled, being absorbed into one after another. I mean, the Egyptian Empire, seemed like it was infallible. I mean, it wasn't going anywhere, and it's not here anymore. The Roman Empire, the Communist Party, on and on and on. And I really think that our current sort of corporate fundamentalism, I like to call it, because it is a fundamentalist system, is not immune to history. And I think what happens is when a system becomes out of sync with what people really want and what they need, then people become politicized and people start to rediscover themselves as citizens and start to demand something different. And I think we're at the point where that's going to start happening. I think you see it on a daily basis. You see organizations like Move On. You see this radio station. I mean, you see lots of people with lots of concerns who are becoming active in doing something about them. And so, I'm very optimistic. There's a large difference between cynicism and skepticism.
Water, by the year 2025, will be as precious a commodity as oil is to people now. They'll be the same type of divvying it up or fighting over it. And right now, I believe Bechtel, Rumsfeld's Bechtel, has a jump on privatizing water. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, Bechtel is one of the companies and some of its subsidiaries that in various parts of the world, including the United States, is taking over from public entities and public utilities the running of the fresh water supply. And we have a story in the book and the film about how they attempted to do this in Bolivia. And it led to the cost of water for the citizens of Cochabamba, which is a region in central Bolivia. The cost of water going sky high, and even rainwater was actually it was illegal for people to collect rainwater. Even rainwater was privatized, and lagoons and various public sources of water. And the people said, we're not going to take this, and they hit the streets in huge numbers and actually took back into public hands and into democratic hands the water supply. And I think it's a story that's a victory, but it's also a story that shows just how far corporations will go in terms of trying to. I mean, in a way, the public domain is the last frontier for corporations. I mean, they are running so many sectors of the economy, but when they look at things like water and public utilities, they salivate. They say, there's something that government's doing that we can actually do for profit. So let's do that. And governments are capitulating to that kind of privatization.
The part that amuses me the most, and also terrifies me simultaneously, which is actually a sensation I enjoy, is the part about the human genome and the notion that people are actually making almost genetic traits proprietary.
Yeah.
So that, brown eyes in 30 years, brown eyes brought to you by Halliburton and Root, or brown eyes brought to, I mean, to the point where, so talk about this because
I mean, patent laws, it's another area where the law has capitulated to corporate lobbying and corporate pressure. I mean, there was a time not very long ago when you simply couldn't patent a life form. And as a result of various decisions in this country by your Supreme Court, you end up in a situation where a life form can be patented, including a strand of DNA, if the patenting entity, which is usually a company, a corporation, can show that there's some kind of a use for it. And a use means that there's some capacity for commercial exploitation. And I think, what water shows, what the genome shows, what these examples show is that unless we are really careful and really diligent and really vigilant, corporations are going to end up sort of in the very sinews of ourselves and our society, and everything is going to be something that's simply there for commercial exploitation.
People think that, when people hear about genetic manipulation, the fear is always that scientists are crazy and they're going to. The real problem is that we've now made a profit incentive to create a Frankenstein. Because if you can justify the Frankenstein in some profit way, then somebody will do that.
Well, and not just that, but you've got companies actually funding the science. I mean, and increasingly science itself is being privatized. Science is being funded less and less by public institutions and universities, and more by corporations who, want to develop a particular kind of product and harness the energy and the intelligence of scientists to get it, whether you're talking about the genome or you're talking about chemicals or whatever. So the notion that science is there for the public good itself is under challenge and being threatened.
There's an interesting part in your movie where they show marketing research on nagging. They actually study the nagging habits of children to learn how to manipulate nagging patterns so that the children will nag their parents for more products.
Absolutely, and we talk about that in the book and film. That this is Lucy Hughes, who's at one of the largest or the largest sort of placer of advertising time in the world, and she and her coworkers came up with a scientific breakdown of the way that kids nag, and they realized there are two different ways. And I have a couple of kids, and I've been victim to this, and they can either sort of say, "Mommy, I want the Barbie dream house. I want it. Wine." And basically what they realized is that has an effect on some kind of parents, but not others. So they divided parents into 4 categories, and sort of guilt-ridden single parents will buy the Barbie dream house, but then other kinds of parents won't. For them, the nag has to be what's called a nag with importance. So you have to say, Mommy, I want to buy the Barbie dream house so I can have, Ken and Barbie together and they can have a family and blah, blah, blah. And so to give a reason. And so these 2 different kinds of nags will elicit different responses depending on whether you're one of 4 different kinds of parents. And so they broke all this down scientifically, and then they help advertisers design advertisements that elicit the right kind of nag for the right kind of product for the right kind of demographic.
So it's like when my kid bugs me about Ken and Barbie, I actually see an educational value or a qualitative value to this.
That's right.
That has been predetermined by the advertiser.
Right. And if you're the kind of parent that's important to, then that will make you buy it. But if you're the kind of parent that just wants to shut your kid up because you're working 2 jobs and you don't have proper childcare and blah, 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 then it's actually going to work better if you do the other kind of nag and just drive your parents crazy.
Well, my remedy is don't have kids. And you've been listening to The Majority Report. I'm Janeane Garofalo here with Sam Seder. We've been talking to Joel Bakan, author of The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, which has spawned the award-winning documentary of the same name. You can go to thecorporation.com to find out where it's playing. And you must see this documentary. You must buy this book. And then you can have a very educated conversation with your annoying father about why what's good for the corporation is not good for you. Goodbye.